Well, welcome y'all to those of you who are here and trickling in. So this is our April Fellows Lecture with Dr. Miles Smith, entitled "Finding a Christian America?" Question mark. My name's Nathan Johnson. I'm the provost of Davenant Hall, which is the educational wing of the Davenant Institute. And the mission of the Davenant Institute is to recover the wisdom of classical Protestantism for the renewal of the contemporary church. And we do this in a number of ways. Our press, Davenant Press, publishes original translations of early Protestant theology. We have a print journal and an online journal called Ad Fontes. We also publish original scholarly works concerning major topics in classical Protestantism, including Dr. Miles Smith's upcoming book, coming out next month, entitled "Religion and Republic: Christian America from the Founding to the Civil War." I think we've already got a good bit of pre-orders, and if you want to pre-order that book, you can go to the Davenant Hall website and get that. And I think this talk tonight is going to kind of whet your appetite a little bit for that. Davenant also hosts many conferences at Davenant House, which is our residential study center in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in South Carolina. And we also run Davenant Hall, which is hosting our Fellows Lecture tonight. Davenant Hall is a full online graduate program modeled after the medieval university, but for the digital age. And we offer online Master of Letters in Classical Protestantism. We also offer numerous graduate certificates and courses open to auditors as well. With that said, I want to introduce Dr. Miles Smith as our Fellows Lecturer tonight. Dr. Miles Smith is a trained historian. He teaches at Hillsdale College, and he attended university at the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina, and received his PhD from Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. You may have been happy with how their football team did a couple years ago.
Except for the national championship game.
Except for that. Yes, big asterisk there. His research is on the United States South and the Atlantic world. And he generally writes on intellectual history, but occasionally dabbles in political history as well. He edits 19th century works of historical theology. You can find many of his writings in popular journals such as Ad Fontes, Mere Orthodoxy, the Gospel Coalition, Public Discourse, the Federalist, and the University Bookman. And like I said, you can pre-order his book, Religion and Republic, right now on the Davenant Institute website, so you don't want to miss that. Well, with no further ado, Miles, we'll kick it off to you.
Thank you, Nathan, so much. And thank you to Davenant Institute and Davenant Hall for letting me give this talk. Thanks to all the hard work the press did to make the book look fantastic. I have page proofs in front of me, and they look really exceptional. I want to thank Mark Hamilton and especially thank Reese Laverty for the work they've done. They were tireless. Thanks to outgoing President Brad Littlejohn for his kind words encouraging the project. I want to thank especially Kevin DeYoung for the forward that he was kind enough to write for this book. It's excellent. And I could sit here and thank everybody, but what I want to do tonight is read from the preface and then get into the introduction to the book, because I want to sort of explain why I wrote this book when I did. I wrote this book because I got tired of the way that the conversation over quote unquote Christian nationalism was happening. And I wanted to sort of think historically about the question and not merely politically or in a partisan context. I wanted to sort of ask serious questions about how did Americans historically intersect in what we would call religion and politics, church and state. But I wanted to do more than mere sort of establishment versus disestablishment. And so that's the sort of origins of the project. And so what I want to do is read some from the preface. I begin by noting that there's a book, and it's a very good book, by John Fea, and it's called Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? It's about 20 years old now. It's a very good book that deals with the sort of social and religious and political foundations of religion during the constitutional era, during the formation of the Constitution. And John Fia says this, and I think it's worth noting. If the United States was ever a Christian nation, it was so during the period between the ratification of the Constitution and the start of the Civil War. Although the Constitution, Fia argues, mandated that, quote, there would be no official or established religion in America, and the states were gradually removing religious requirements for office holders, Christianity, and particularly Protestant evangelicalism, defined the culture. And I think the important thing to note as we begin is Protestant, what we call Protestant evangelicalism. I prefer the term evangelical Protestantism, by the way. I don't think there's any such thing as evangelicalism. I do think there's such thing as Protestantism. It defined the culture across the United States. It wasn't limited to any one region. There are different expressions of Protestant thought and Protestant institutions in the South, in the Mid-Atlantic states, in New England. But none of those expressions were so totally different that they sort of failed to uphold a broad cultural, social, and what I would even say civil Protestant order. That Protestant order was not ambiguous. One of the notes I make is that just because there wasn't an established church doesn't mean there wasn't a broad Protestant order. I think we've been too quick to assume that that which is religious must therefore be churchly. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book like I did. This is not a history of churches. It's a history of religion. And religion, I note in the preface, is something that really infuses all parts of life. I don't think we can limit the understanding of Christianity to that which is merely churchly. There's such things as Christian families, there's Christian hospitals, there's Christian colleges and Christian schools. So the fact that these aren't churches doesn't annihilate their religious commitments. And so likewise, we should understand that culture, society, and the civil sphere can have religious commitments without them needing to be churchly. There's a good case to be made. I agree with the case that the founders made about disestablishment. I don't think that meant that they were trying to sort of take religion out of the respective institutional life of given institutions in the nation. And so that's one of the points I make here. So what I'm going to do now is read a little bit more and hopefully sort of square this, because I think one of the things to note too is this was not a disposition that was just held, say, by sort of establishmentarian Congregationalists or disestablishmentarian Presbyterians like the faculty of Princeton Seminary. This was something that Witherspoon would have agreed on with Baptists in his era. And so I make a note of this. John Fia, I think, is right on the merits. In many ways, the United States was a Christian nation between 1789 and 1861, and few, if any, major Protestant divines or intellectuals wasted their efforts denouncing the Christian nation which they lived in. Charles Hodge, the principal of Princeton Seminary and perhaps still the best-known Presbyterian of the 19th century, wanted to keep America Christian, for example, for the sake of the Sabbath. He called Anglo-Americans, quote, a Sabbath-keeping people. And it was the religious habits of that Sabbath-keeping people, he said, that they were to be highly prized and sedulously guarded. And in this country especially, we should be watchful lest the influx of immigrants or other nationalities deprive us of this great distinction and its blessings. This is not a call to nationhood. It's a call to preserve a particular social and religious culture. On whether that's good or bad, we have to ask why Hodge proposed that. Baptist luminary Isaac Bacchus, for example, was, and I'm quoting now, convinced America was not only a Christian nation, but a Protestant one. That's from a committed Baptist, certainly no establishmentarian. Episcopal Bishop George Washington Doane, the second Episcopal Bishop of New Jersey, told his parishioners frequently, by the way, this was just one of the sermons he did a series of them, that the United States was a free, intelligent, and Christian nation. And what's interesting is even immigrant Protestants joined the chorus in encouraging that there was a necessary sort of religious foundation to the political and cultural communities that sustained American liberties. This is from C.F.W. Walther, one of the founders of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and a leader of Saxon Lutheran immigrants, who formed the LCMS in 1947. He was certainly no friend of theocracy, or we should note, of Calvinism. He came to the United States fleeing the syncretic Prussian Union, which had been forced on Lutherans by the Prussian State Church in 1817. Nonetheless, even Walther could sound like a militant establishmentarian at times. He complained that the United States that, quote, here, under the cover of religious freedom, even the principles of natural religion, which sets man apart as human, are often trampled, as these same people proclaim there is no God. The Constitution of the American Republic, said Walther, quote, permits no atheist the right of citizenship. It grants freedom of religion, not freedom from religion. It's important to note that neither Hodge, nor Bacchus, nor Doane, nor Walther were considered theocratic or extremist in the era. They were well within the Protestant mainstream. All four were well known and all four were respected in their own communions and outside of it. So why has there become the question then about religion's influence in the early republic? Why is it a live issue? Well, my proposition is most of this has to do with contemporary American politics. We've sort of rethought this largely in the aftermath of Donald Trump's election victory in 1916. There was, as all of you know, a general election, and Donald Trump threw out the playbook of Republican orthodoxy in order to gain or regain different types of voters. He also, I would note, threw out evangelical leaders that George W. Bush had relied on. Other Christians unused to power or status welcomed the chance to have their voices heard on the national stage. And these people were not afraid to talk about Christian America. Dispossessed evangelical leaders of the Bush Republican Party, many but certainly not all Southern Baptists, used the moment to indict so-called court evangelicals who replaced them, and they accused them of being Trumpist unprincipled hacks. But they weren't only considered unprincipled hacks. They were also, and you can sort of cue the scary music here, Christian nationalists. A half decade after Trump's victory in 2020, this was in 2022, numerous politically minded evangelicals began to embrace the term Christian nationalism. And there's been a whole slew of books about quote unquote Christian nationalism. I myself have been reluctant to use the term. I don't think it's particularly useful for a variety of reasons. Nonetheless, I think we have to address what does it mean in a historical context? What really was going on in that in the historical context? And to do this, I believe we have to separate the idea of evangelicalism from Protestant history. This is one of the reasons why I chose the Davenant Press, which is really committed to Protestant ressourcement and to understanding the history of Protestant that begins with the 16th century and continues to our own day. The ultimate purpose of this history then is to wed Protestant ressourcement with a relatively scholarly history of the early republic that posits the United States within a continuing Protestant tradition and not an evangelical one. And I've made that distinction very purposefully. Evangelicals are Protestants who understand themselves to be, according to Thomas S. Kidd, who's a very, very capable, a very excellent Southern Baptist historian. Kidd describes evangelicals as born-again Protestants who cherish the Bible as the Word of God and who emphasize a personal relationship with Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit. British historian David Bebbington defined four hallmarks of evangelicals as one, a commitment to biblicism, which is a particular hermeneutic regarding Christian scriptures. Two, crucicentrism, or prioritizing atonement as the major thematic priority of preaching and teaching. Three, conversionism, which was a dialectic regarding Christian conversions that in some ways is at odds with historic Lutheran, Anglican, and Reformed understandings of baptism's efficacy. And lastly, activism, or the belief that true Christianity needs to be shown through efforts at moral and social reform. In Kidd and Bebbington's definitions, evangelical Christianity is highly personal and wedded to subjective experience. Institutions in the evangelical reading are secondary in their importance in the Christian life, if even important at all. The distinction, therefore, between evangelical and Protestant is crucial. Evangelical historians have told the history of religion in the United States as one of social and moral transformation, typically centering around a set of events successively. The Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, and moral reformers. The Second Great Awakening, the revivals of the early 19th century. The ministry of men like Dwight Moody and Charles Spurgeon and other popular ministers in the Gilded Age. The fundamentalist modernist controversy of the early 21st century, and the mid-century works of Carl F. Henry, the eventual rise of the moral majority in the 1970s and 80s, and most recently, evangelical support for Donald Trump. So these are these epochs that define a sort of constantly evolving evangelical tradition. The problem with this historiographic reading is that religious commitments of civil and political institutions are generally ignored. Andrew Wilson's recent Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West, for example, posits that 1776 and the advent of the American Republic, among other things, remade the world and in many ways remade Protestant Christianity into evangelicalism. Quotes there around evangelicalism. Nathan Finn noted in his review of Wilson's book that evangelicals needed to, quote, remember that the same century that gave rise to our modern world also gave rise to the modern evangelical movement. The earliest generations of evangelicals flourished in the dawning days of the world in which contemporary evangelicals now live, end quote. Mark Knoll, the dean of evangelical identifying historians, wrote of the era between 1750 and 1850 as one of almost complete theological and civil transformation. His very good America's God, quote, describes a shift away from European theological traditions, descended directly from the Protestant Reformation, towards a Protestant evangelical theology, decisively shaped by its engagement with revolutionary and post-revolutionary America, end quote. Knoll proposed that, quote, 19th century Protestant evangelicalism differed from the religion of the Protestant Reformation as much as 16th century Reformation Protestantism differed from the Roman Catholic theology from which it emerged, end quote. My own thought was that was an overstatement, and a problematic overstatement. Essentially that if Protestants believed that they inherited the faith once received, how could we say that and say that our faith had been truly revolutionized merely by something like the American Revolution? And so I started to ask a series of questions. It was not meant to be disrespectful to the legacy of Knoll, but it was meant to engage him. For example, for Knoll, American religion was created by older, quote, expectations for church and theology inherited from Europe giving way. The process that ended with an intimate union between evangelical and revolutionary politics began with disruption in historic colonial churches. That disruption for Knoll lay in the Great Awakening and in ministers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Knoll sees religion in this context as a set of social and intellectual propositions. He has little to say on the connection between colonial religion and colonial socio-political institutions. Indeed, the complete absence of the deep connection between 17th century religion and English ideas of commonwealth are, as one reviewer of America's God noted, conspicuously absent. English Protestant, Anglican and Puritan, notions of government and religion, and the symbiosis between the two, I would propose, were built in to American political and social institutions. Religious society might change, but institutional Protestantism was embedded in the American order in ways that mere social and religious revivals could not and did not easily change. Perhaps unintentionally, evangelical historians have applied that the American Revolution was far more radical than it actually was regarding religion. Two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Bernard Bailyn famously noted that the primary goal of the American Revolution was not the overthrow or even the alteration of the existing social order, but the preservation of political liberty. Religion, I would argue, undoubtedly part of the social order, was never meant to be revolutionized, nor was its place in the social and political realms meant to be transformed. The history presented in the volume that I hope you're going to buy ultimately sees Protestant continuity in the early republic, where evangelicals see transformation, where they see a religious novus ordo seclorum, a new world order. I see a lingering Protestant ancient regime, old regime, built into American institutions, like colleges and state laws and diplomatic practice, among other things. That this Protestant order was disestablished and not theocratic did not make it any less Protestant, any less in order, or any less institutional. American Protestants did not recreate the Calvinist oligarchy of Geneva or Lutheran monarchies of Germany, but neither did they recreate Protestantism or become something other than Protestant. John Jay, the founding father and famously one of the first Supreme Court Justice of the United States, saw an essential Protestant continuity and commonality in the new American Republic when he told the people of New York in 1787 that, quote, Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, and professing the same religion. Jay and many other early Republic statesmen and divines saw a continuity between the British Protestant milieu they were born in and the new American nation they constituted in 1789. Where does that leave us? Well, since roughly 1980, the history of religion, and particularly Protestantism in the United States, has been litigated along a series of binaries: evangelical versus mainline, theocratic versus secular, liberal versus conservative, etc., etc. While these binaries are not artificial in themselves, they are particularly problematic if applied retroactively to the early republic or any point in history that precedes the so-called evangelical historiography created in the latter part of the 20th century. Consequently, Americans have little understanding of religion in the 19th century, and more importantly, they have no idea how the fundamental laws of the United States reconciled Protestantism to a disestablished Republican order. This book is an attempt to explain that reconciliation, or, depending on your viewpoint, lack thereof. And my broad thesis, if you're looking for a thesis, is that there wasn't actually any reconciliation that needed to take place. The American Revolution wasn't deistic or even Lockean, and it certainly wasn't secular. It was a conservative revolution led by generally Protestant Anglophone, meaning English-speaking North Americans. The laws of the colonies were not remade wholesale or stripped of their Christian foundations. In fact, Christianity was baked into the early republic's diplomatic, educational, judicial, and legislative regimes. And institutional Christianity and state apparatuses coexisted comfortably within a disestablishmentarian order. This book, I should note, is not an endorsement of the early republic socio-religious order, but neither is it a polemical condemnation. It's an offering to modern evangelical Protestants who have not dealt with the history of religion in the United States on historically useful terms. The fundamentalist modernist controversy of the early 20th century and the rise of so-called evangelicalism in its aftermath convinced evangelical Protestants that they had a sort of religious tabula rasa by which they could carve a new and typically triumphalist history of quote-unquote evangelicalism in America. The problem is that quote unquote evangelicalism doesn't have much of a history unless you think that history started sometime in the 1940s in Wheaton. But Protestantism does. And it's important for evangelical Protestants to ask hard questions about their own rhetoric and their philosophy of history and their historical antecedents, that we might disagree with the political theology of historical Christian figures should not lead us to anathematize them. The long documented individualism and anti-traditionalism of evangelicalism has risen to the point of dogma for figures like Christianity Today's chief editor Russell Moore, who see the historic Christian idea of discipling the nations nearly as heresy. Christian nationalism, he argued in 2023, is dangerous for the witness hold on. There we go. Dangerous for the witness of the church because Christian nationalism is fundamentally at its core anti-evangelical. If what the gospel means is for people to come before God person by person, not nation by nation or village by village or tribe by tribe, then Christian nationalism is heretical, end quote. But if Christian nationalism is simply the idea that nations and tribes can be saved as well as individuals, we have a bit of a problem on our hands. Because most Christians before the 20th century made space for communitarian concepts of salvation. Does Russell Moore think that St. Paul, the Church Fathers, John Calvin, Thomas Cranmer, Martin Luther, and the Protestants of the early Republic were heretics? I don't think he does. So why would we have this conversation about Christian nationalism now? It seems to be all about politics and Trump. But you didn't buy this book, or I hope you won't buy this book, to read about that. My hope is you probably want to know more about Protestants, religion, and the civil and social order of the United States in 1789 and 1860. This book, I should note, does not purport to posit that the United States was a Christian nation in the early 19th century, despite perhaps it being described that way with good purpose. My own belief is that the United States was a republic of Christians that were committed to what I've chosen to call in this book Christian institutionalism. Early Republic Protestants wanted to maintain Christian principles in their nation's various social and political institutions without sacralizing those principles or subordinating the American Republic to a church. Christianity and the Christian church are not synonyms. There are Christian nurses, Christian artists, and yes, even Christian politicians, as strange as that might seem. My state representative, for example, is a friend and a devout Lutheran. That he is not a theocrat does not annihilate his Lutheranism or his Christianity. Orestes Bronson, the famous Catholic writer of the Civil War era, wrote in his introduction to his opus, The American Republic, "I write throughout because I am a Christian. As a Christian, as a Catholic. I could not write otherwise if I would, and would not if I could. Likewise, I admit to writing in this work as a Christian and as an Anglican, and while that does not factor into my analysis per se, it does mean I have chosen to write on a religion that reflects the irenic Protestant disposition I believe my own confession reflects. Christianity is more than merely the Sunday worship hour. And to suppose that the church is the only Christian institution is to impose forms of 20th century clericalist dogma on early Republican Americans who believe that Christianity permeated almost every aspect of their life. Church and state in the United States, I should note, is well-trod historiographic territory. Since 1980, professional Christian historians have formed a historiography that has often been done to disprove hagiographies associated with its historical tropes and utilized for political purposes. John Fia's Was America Founded as a Christian Nation and the works of my own colleague and friend D.G. Hart, I think are necessary correctives to hagiographies of non-professionals, such as the late D. James Kennedy or David Barton. Other historians and Political scientists like Mark David Hall, James Kabbalah, and Daniel Dreisbach have offered important works that make a compelling case for what the aims of the Constitution's writers were regarding the national settlement on church and state. Carl Esbick and Jonathan Den Hartog have recently published what I think is the authoritative account of state disestablishment. Mark Knowles' America's God and America's Book are excellent accounts of religious culture, but rely on a sort of retroactive taxonomy of quote-unquote evangelical that I think limits understanding of how Protestants viewed themselves, how they exercised political and social power, and how they saw their ability to shape society and the state. A plethora of books on Southern religion exists, but with the noted exception of Baylor professor Robert Elder's The Sacred Mirror, which excellently, I think, and convincingly argues that Southern evangelicals were not individualistic or proponents of a merely spiritual Christianity. Most works on Southern religion deal with chattel slavery. The work in your hands, or that I hope will be in your hands soon, does not spend a significant amount of time on the relationship of Southern slaveholding to the American Republic's state apparatuses or to North American churches. Not because slavery's relationship to those institutions is insignificant or unimportant, but because there are already excellent works on those respective subjects in print. Charles Irons' Pro-Slavery Christianity and David Erickson's Slavery in the American Republic, for example, are two good books to consider for those respective topics. But given the amount of energy, intellectual energy given to slavery of the last 2 decades, and the multitudes of books that have been published on the subject, I have very purposefully not made it the focus of this study. Christian, and moreover, specifically Protestant, social and civil foundations of the United States are, I believe, historically incontrovertible. I lay out what evidence I can in this work. My main addendum would be to note that what is variously called secularism or pluralism, or what might be more accurately described as the right to be irreligious, but not necessarily anti-religious, has a time-honored and legally protected place in the American civil life and should continue to have this place. That is not, however, because secularism or pluralism are unmitigated goods on their own terms. In the 19th century, Protestant divines rightly celebrated the Protestant foundation of the United States, but they understood that those Protestant foundations guaranteed liberties that included the right of the individual to live without churchly invasiveness in the American order. The federal union was never meant to create a secular state or states, but it was also not meant to create a specific type of religious citizen. Protestant religion, nonetheless, and broad civil liberty, including the liberty to not be Protestant, went hand in hand. In an 1852 sermon, the pastor of Pittsburgh's First Presbyterian Church, Nathaniel West, proposed that the United States was indeed a Protestant nation. God had appointed the Republic to be the new protective ark of God. And what was protected in that ark? Religious liberty. The very name Protestant, said West, associates with it whatever is held sacred as to genuine religion and civil liberty. Pure religion and well-regulated civil liberty were the strong instrumental arms of sure protection to a nation. Where they are, God is, and where he is, their temporal and spiritual salvation are. Religion and civil liberty were all to any nation required for, quote, safety and prosperity. Give these two blessings to any people, and they must flourish. Take them away, and all that is debasing, demoralizing, and enslaving must follow. West listed the denominations he believed bore testimony against old world tyrannies, which he variously described as monarchy, aristocracy, and the Roman Catholic hierarchy, but interestingly enough, not the Roman Catholic laity or parish priest. His list of denominations protecting liberty was ecumenical, but still Protestant. He denominated Lutherans, the Church of England, Scottish Presbyterians, Methodists, and various other Protestant sects as friends of God's ark, the United States, but also noted that there were enemies to the ark as well. With the ark, nonetheless, he associated everything, quote, sacred and venerable in religion and civil liberty. The United States was a Protestant ark dedicated to the liberty of its citizens to be more than to be Protestant, but also more than Protestant. Religious historians and political scientists rightly push back against the notion of a de-churched, de-Christianized, and anti-religious early republic United States. Yet the Protestant founders, 52 of the 50 signers of the Declaration were Protestants, by the way, as were the majority of the Constitution signers, very purposely rejected religious tests to sustain any type of religiosity. This rejection was not to actualize en masse secularism, but to establish a broad-based religious order that would particularly include Jews and Catholics, among others. Their inclusion, nonetheless, rested on Anglo-Protestant foundations of civil liberty. The United States' religious order would understandably become more than Protestant, but it would never be anything less than Protestant either. So that's the preface. And so what I want to do for the next about 20 minutes, and Nathan, if you can wave at me when the time kind of arrives to wind down, is to talk a little bit more about specifics. What's going on? What's the meat of this? My first kind of proposition to note is that I'm not saying anything revolutionarily sort of new. I'm hopefully making other things more accessible. But what is different than what I'm saying than what you might hear in your average textbook? Well, I'll start with the promulgation of the Constitution, 1789. Protestants in the early republic affirmed disestablishment. You know that. You've heard that before. But what you might not have heard is that they typically broke with Jefferson and Madison, who sought to remove religion's influence from the civil and social orders in ways that other Protestants were profoundly uncomfortable with. Protestants could simultaneously believe that disestablishment was good and that only a society of pious Christians could properly create an actual disestablishmentarian order and make it work. Christianity, in their minds, was a necessary foundation for disestablishment. Methodist intellectual leader, journalist, and theologian Nathan Bangs, summarized the position broadly shared by Protestants in 1850. The history of the world, he wrote, quote, from the sin of Adam nearly to the present time, showed that generally wickedness prevailed, and that the principles of intolerance were incorporated in all religious establishments then existing. Intolerance via religious establishments, Bangs argued, began to gradually improve at the beginning of the 18th century and in the 19th century, when the principles, quote, the principles of religious toleration were more generally understood and exemplified in practice among the several nations of the earth. Bangs and most American Protestants did not perceive disestablishment as a rejection of Christianity's place in society, but as its culmination. Disestablishment did not assign the church merely to a spiritual role in society. It elevated the church's role above political meddling. Disestablishment was the apotheosis of a Christian society and not its termination. The effect of the Christian gospel and its rejection brought about disestablishment, according to Bangs. He wrote that the, quote, influence of the gospel truths among understandings and consciences of mankind, that influence which penetrates the hearts and converts the sinners of saints, as it converts the hearts of sinners into saints and makes him a new creature, end quote, led Christians to see the wrongness of coercing consciences. When sinners were created new, the laws of God were written on their hearts, and that law which requires us to do as we would do according to God's will. God's law exerts a controlling effect upon the conscience. A population governed by God's law could no more oppress their fellow man, abridge of their rights, or inflict pains and penalties for differences of opinion than they could wish those acts of injustice should be visited on themselves. Bangs argued that this light of his truth reflected from the throne of God upon the renewed Christian's heart, but was not confined there. Its rays shoot forth in every direction, and the world around him becomes enlightened. Consequently, the principles of civil as well as religious liberty have been widely diffused among the nations, by which means the bands of sectarian jealousies have been broken, denominational pride and bigotry have been in a measure destroyed. Across the globe in the 19th century, the march of the gospel meant that, quote, civil despotism would lose its hold in many places and it's losing its hold in others. This loss of despotism came from, quote, true Christianity's benign influence. It was from that Christian influence that the minds of statesmen were enlightened. Quote, religion and civil bigotry weakened, and the principles of civil liberty embedded in the human heart. Bangs believed that the tenements of disestablishment allowed for the folly of religious tolerance to be seen in its religious intolerance to be seen in its own odious and hateful character. Like many early Republic Protestants, Bangs averred that it was easy to trace the hand of God in bringing about this delightful work. So, Bangs' voluntarist order seems to be something that was shared broadly. But this voluntarist order was not, to 19th century Americans, something that created a deinstitutionalized or toothless religious or political order. Benjamin Morris could claim with some truth in 1864 that he was a violently committed disestablishmentarian, while also arguing that the United States was, quote, a Christian nation, first in name, and secondly, because of the many and mighty elements of a pure Christianity that had given its character and shaped its destiny from the beginning. It is preeminently the land of the Bible, of the Christian church, and of the Christian Sabbath. Like the Methodist Bangs, Presbyterian Morris declared that Christianity was an aspect of free society. America was, quote, the land of great, extensive, and often repeated revivals of spiritual religion, precisely because it was the land of free conscience and of free speech, the land of noble charities, and of manifold and earnest efforts for the elevation and welfare of the human race. And like Bangs, Morris submitted that a free disestablishmentarian regime rested only on society-wide Christian piety. The chief security and glory of the United States, he wrote, has been, is now, and will forever be the prevalence and domination of the Christian faith. If Christian influence American Republic did not realize all the possible blessings of a free government, the reason lay less in the genius of the economy than the acknowledged imperfections of human nature. Where then do we get the idea that the United States was secular or even irreligious? Most of it comes from Thomas Jefferson. The idea that there was a sort of Jeffersonian separationist order. This is inconsistent with the actual Constitution's commitments, which allowed for the federal and state governments to sustain religion and even institutional religion. So this sounds strange. This may sound strange to readers at the beginning of the 21st century. 70 years of jurisprudence from the Supreme Court and more recent battles over question of quote-unquote theocracy or so-called Christian nationalism have convinced a significant number of evangelicals that any state involvement with Christianity is both un-American or perhaps an invasion of a supposedly pure Christian practice. In conservative Calvinist circles, this has been particularly pronounced, with breathless denunciations of theocracy or liberalism thrown about by partisans of secularist spirituality of the church, devotees or devotees of a more robust public Christianity. The United States' religious order, it's worth noting, was from the beginning neither theocratic nor secular. And the notion that disestablishment created a secular order, we should note, is distinctly 20th century, particularly a mid-20th century creation. The 1947 case, Everson v. Board of Education, first argued that neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church. Neither can they pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion or another. State and federal governments after 1947 could not levy any money whatsoever to support any religious activities or institutions, whatever they may be called, or whatever form they may adopt or teach or practice religion. State and federal government could not, quote, openly or secretly participate in the affairs of any religious organizations or groups or vice versa. The Supreme Court said, in the words of Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. First time this is included in a legal document in United States history, we should note, is 1947. Now, popular as the idea of separation of church and state might be among secularists or neoliberal evangelicals or some more sectarian Christian groups, it was not the vision of the writers of the Constitution, nor was it a reason they supported federal disestablishment. Daniel Dreisbach rightfully notes that construing the First Amendment's religious provisions as a wall of separation, quote, would have come as a surprise to members of the first Congress who framed the amendment. The first Congress, quote, appropriated funds from the public treasury to pay for congressional chaplains, enacted legislation pertaining to oaths, issued religious proclamations, and reauthorized the Northwest Ordinance, which specifically provided federal funding for church buildings. The Northwest Ordinance, an early draft of which was written by none other than Thomas Jefferson, declared religion, quote, necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. These declarations, Dreisbach argued, were not reconcilable with Everson's innovations. In the 19th century, with widespread acceptance of the fact of disestablishment, ambiguity nonetheless existed over what disestablishment meant in practice. Edward Norris Kirk, a Congregationalist and later Presbyterian minister trained at Princeton Seminary under Archibald Alexander, envisioned religion, and particularly Protestant religion, as the moral catechizer for Republican society. Kirk was a proponent of disestablishment, but he did not see the disestablished church as a closed institution. The church's moral influence necessarily tied it to the state and to society. In 1848, for example, he argued that the institutions that sustained, quote, modern society and civilization were family, state, school, and church. All those, Kirk declared, were gifts of our beneficent Creator, and all were sanctioned by his authority. It was to men, however, who represented in their persons not the family, nor the academy, nor the commonwealth, but the church, that our Lord announced, ye are the salt of the earth. Christ designed the church's influence, Kirk wrote, to show society that as salt is endowed with the property of preserving animal and vegetable esculents from decay, so, and this final word is in this final sentence is in all caps, The church is the chief conservative power in the moral world. The church's moral influence, according to Kirk, preserved man and state and society from that degeneracy which they are ever trending. Differences of opinion regarding the nature of the constitutional settlement on religion and the federal state were ostensibly settled through the First Amendment's de facto establishment of a non-sectarian and religiously neutral federal government. But to Kirk, that did not necessarily preclude state establishments or even religious federal politics. His ambivalence about the constitutional settlement indicated that it was neither universally celebrated nor, more importantly, even understood as late as 1850. Kirk wrote that the relations of the civil to the religious institutions of our country are by no means fully and clearly determined. Twice this question has been practically solved. New England's Pilgrim Fathers, he said, made the civil and ecclesiastical states identical. The New England theocracy, he admitted, produced some very evil consequences, but Kirk argued that eventually the New England theocracy led to the Revolutionary Fathers choosing an opposite course that made this church and state two distinct and independent empires that nonetheless occupied the same territory and control in part the same persons, but they did not necessarily know of each other's existence. The contemporary constitutional arrangement, for all its benefits, according to Kirk, still had its share of human imperfection, especially regarding the relationship between education, religion, and Republican society at large. He worried that it has not been settled, for example, on clearly defined principles what position the school shall occupy, relatively to church and state. He worried that, quote, every discussion about introducing the Bible and even history in our schools has betrayed the imperfection of our theories. He worried that respective people's concerns over introduction of the Bible meant that no one was prepared, quote, to make common education entirely secular. And therein lay, he believed, the conundrum of the constitutional settlement. Quote, to make instruction religious, it must have some shape. It must be founded upon some doctrine. It must use a Bible, King James, or some other version. Finally, Kirk noted this. The place of religion and education illustrated the degree to which the United States' disestablishmentarian regime remained conservative socially. And inasmuch as the church was part of the social order, it would retain a conserving place. The domestic order sustained by the American Republic upheld what were perceived as traditional notions not only of gender and family, but of religion as well. Political liberties that early Republic Americans, both men and women, associated with republicanism and democracy, upheld the Christian family and social order. Christianity, democracy, and family existed in a mutually affirming symbiosis. Social reformer and women's rights activist Catherine Beecher's 1846 work on domestic economy for women proposed that women should receive the Declaration of Independence proclamation, that all men were created equal and all were entitled to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as, quote, only another mode of expressing the fundamental principle which the great ruler of the universe has established as the law of his government. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And whatever ye would do that man should do ye even so to them. These scriptural forms, Beecher wrote, which God, quote, the supreme lawgiver, required that each individual of our own race shall regard the happiness of others, as it shall regard the happiness of others as of the same value of his own, and which forbids any institution in private or civil life from securing advantages to one class by sacrificing the interest of another. Democracy, to Beecher, entailed mutual forbearance and social solidarity, not sociological leveling. The principles of democracy, and more specifically, the principal features of American democracy, Beecher flatly stated, are identical with the principles of Christianity. So I'll land there. Buy the book. There's more fun stuff in it. That's only a little selection of the quotes, and so I'll hand it off to Nathan now.
Well, thank you, Miles. That's a really good appetizer for the larger book. Um, hopefully a lot of you will pick that up. So our Q&A is opened. Hopefully y'all see that at the bottom of Zoom. So feel free to type in your questions and I'll read them to Miles. I thought I'd start us off with one as the audience is thinking about questions. Now I'm gonna ask you kind of a historical analysis question. So I'm not asking you to be an expert here because you're kind of
Okay.
speculating a little bit, but do you think that where we've gotten to now, which is kind of the high secularization of American society, it's because of because this Protestant disestablishmentarian ethic actually failed on its own terms, like it kind of undermined itself, or do you think it kind of got killed from the outside? If that question makes sense.
I think it's both. In some ways, I think it probably was actually more successful than advertised. I think that especially in as much as there's a lot of fears about the way sort of civil there was a lot of fears, especially among evangelical circles, of civil religion. You know, the fear is that, well, a Protestant culture stopped caring about spiritual stuff and we just had civil religion, and that's not good. I don't really think that that's what killed the churches, especially the mainline. My argument is that the churches killed themselves. It wasn't the Protestant social and political order. It was the churches themselves liberalizing. Uh, and then they turned around and influenced the political order. I think that for the most part, you can look at the United States government, especially as late as the 1870s, is considerably more conservative than even some of the mainline leadership. So the religious institutions that are sort of inculcated in the government, chaplaincies are a good example, are not as sort of taken with German criticism as the churches themselves are. So I think this is one of the maybe things to think about, is we tend to sort of blame the government for the church's problems. That's something you see on the right and the left, and I tend to think that the church needs to own up to its own problems. I think that the church is responsible for its own heterodoxy. I am kind of a two kingdoms guy in some ways, and so I think that guess what? The church can't blame the state when it goes in a heterodox fashion, and so that's sort of an answer. Not a very good one, I would admit. So I think it's hard to pin down. I think my answer would be that the reflexive tendency to blame the government or the state for the change in religious culture in the United States is overwrought.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So we got a question here. Why do contemporary confessional Presbyterians of a certain stripe react so negatively to the reapproachment of historical Protestant political philosophy?
I think that's from my good friend Ben Glaser, who I know in real life. And if you're ever in the South Carolina upstate and want to go to a very wonderful church, you should visit him. My answer is that they're all ex-fundamentalists. And so a lot of church history is written by ex-fundamentalists who have I think a specific set of fundamentalists and quietists believes on not merely church and state, but on eschatology and stuff like that. Anything that kind of gets out of a certain box of beliefs that were sort of in currency in the 70s and 80s is a threat. And so I think ex-fundamentalism is a not improbable culprit. I think it's a tendency to sort of be uncomfortable with Protestantism before the fundamentalist modernist controversy. I think that's what's going. There's actually a bit of a fear to have a philosophy of history that allows you to take seriously an idea that precedes the creation of quote unquote evangelicalism in the mid-century or the fundamentalist modernist controversy at the beginning of the 20th century. So that's not meant to be a cop-out. I do think that it has something to do with it, sort of a reflexive ex-fundamentalist intellectual telos. So,
And with that, do you think that there's kind of an assumption that anything that smacks of like institutional Christianity is kind of like the dead Anglican
yeah,
Christianity sort of thing?
absolutely. That's a great question. I'm giving a talk at I'm ISI. I'm one of the honors tutors at the at ISI this summer, and Tom Saruff and I had a conversation. And one of the things I note is that there's a quote unquote evangelical reflex to say the church isn't the building, it's it's the people. No, the church is definitely a building, and that's not an un-Protestant thing to say. If we were to have walked into, right, a Lutheran church at the beginning of the 17th century in Germany, or an Anglican church, or even a Scottish Presbyterian church, and we were to say, "Hey, you guys know that this isn't like the church isn't the building," they would look at you weird, because they understand no, the church is a building, and it's a space, and there's religious things that happen in that space, and so I think that we have a reflex to not think of the church as an institution. We have the tendency to think of it as a culture. But it's more than that. It's more than a sociology. It's more than a culture. It's an institution with a building, right? The church meets somewhere. And so I think that's one of those sort of, I don't want to call it goofy because it sounds pejorative, but sort of goofy evangelical, sloganizations that have gotten turned into dogma.
Mm-hmm. We've got a good question, a couple questions here from our very own Scott Pryor. So is Gordon Wood in his book The Radicalism of American Revolution, is he just simply incorrect in what he's claiming?
I think that Wood overstates the case significantly. So whether he's incorrect, he's a dean of the field of late 18th century study, and if you know anything about the American Revolution, we owe a big debt to Gordon Wood. So I'm certainly not important enough to reflexively say he's wrong, but I do think it's overstated. I tend to think that when we think of the radicalism of the American Revolution, we're prioritizing the dispositions of a certain group of founders. Um, for one of the things that's interesting is George Washington was really uncomfortable with reprisals against Tories in his own Virginia, largely because those reprisals were typically aimed at religious institutions, the Church of England, what becomes the Episcopal Church, and Washington was uncomfortable with that because he was not planning on revolutionizing society. I tell my undergrads this. I ask them, "Who's in charge of Virginia when it's in 1774, before it's part of the independent United States?" And they say, "Well, these landholding, slaveholding magnates." I'm like, "Yeah, that's right." Who's in charge of Virginia after the American Revolution? The same people. So the idea that there's some en masse revolution on the ground, I think, is overstated. So to Professor Pryor's question, I think it's overstated. And if that means I'm sort of winking and saying I think he's more wrong than not, maybe that's the case. So
Well, he says two cheers for cultural Christianity, but three cheers for institutional Christianity. Um, in this whole debate with, or we won't call it debate, but all the the talk about Christian nationalism and other forms of cultural engagement over the last several years. The emphasis on institutions versus culture, I mean, obviously those aren't really necessarily opposed, but how would you kind of unpack what Christian institutionalism would look like versus kind of just broadly Christian culturalism?
Yeah, I think Christian institutionalism means that it's perfectly valid. For example, my hometown is Charlotte, North Carolina, and there is Presbyterian Hospital in right uptown Charlotte. And it was formed by Presbytery formed it in 1906, and I think it was 6 or 7 churches gave money for it. I think we need to treat seriously the claims of these churches that they thought they could sustain a hospital on principles they had received from the Presbyterian Church. That doesn't mean that hospital is a church. It does mean I think we need to take seriously the idea that they are doing something that is attempting to put the Christian practice in an institution. And we need to take that seriously. Our evangelical reflex is to always sort of to say, well, what if they do this? And we're almost looking for institutions to fail on Christian terms. And so if you're going to look for a Christian institution to fail, you're going to be you're going to be disappointed, right? Because it will fail, because it's a human institution. It's funny that no one says that when a church fails, they don't say, well, that church isn't Christian anymore, right? Well, if we were to look every time a church failed on something, why don't we annihilate it? And I think it's because what we're doing is we're applying churchly terms to non-church institutions. We're expecting other institutions to be a church when those institutions aren't churches. And this is kind of a category failure here, right? People who get mad at the state or a school or a hospital for failing, and if that hospital makes Christian claims, we sort of say, well, shouldn't you have been perfect? Well, no, they're not ever claiming. That's not the proposition, right? And they're not even claiming to operate on a synonymous moral foundation as churches are.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. Okay, we've got a series of questions here. We'll see if we can unpack this. So, do you personally think the U.S. Constitution's prohibition of religious tests for office, which allows even atheists to rule, was the wisest policy in retrospect? We'll take that first.
That's a good question. I think that historically in the 19th century, so I'll give a historian's answer. I think it's pretty clear that people didn't really think of the Jonathan Den Hartog actually speaks to Den Hartog and Esbeck actually speak to this in their book. Historically, people didn't understand the First Amendment as applying to them the same way we do. So, for example, no one in a state thinks that the First Amendment applies to them in a specific way. So states felt very free to maintain certain types of religious tests. That no one really seems to get too worked up about that. I think that in some ways the federal statute on it was not particularly important one way or the other. It's the fact that states understood that the First Amendment just didn't have to do with them. And because of that, there's sort of almost a principle of subsidiarity that happened with the nature of religion and politics. No one was going to be elected just ex nihilo, right, into federal office. They probably had some time in a state office or something like that. And so it wasn't, the federal actual statutes weren't that determinative. So to the question about whether it's prudential today or not, I think the better thing would be to ask, why have we sort of hamstrung states on certain things?
Yeah, that makes sense. That'd be kind of the organic way to avoid some of the stuff that we've got now. What are some of the ways that conversations about religion and establishment in America have related themselves to or been situated within international conversations on these questions, or even just within the Americas?
Very good question. I think that one of the failures of Protestant discourse, conservative Protestant discourse, has been it hasn't been international enough. There's just a reflex to sort of litigate it on in a very Americentric evangelical kind of taxonomy. So, for example, on questions of establishmentarian principles, I think it's worth looking at the experience of the Church of England. Um, Likewise, the questions on Christian culture, I think that things in Britain, evangelicals in Britain, I'm an Anglican, we look to Nigeria quite a bit. Um, and so I think that just reflexively kind of coming back to the American experience can actually be unhelpful. So, for example, the question of disestablishment versus establishment. Well, I'm kind of a disestablishmentarian. I don't think it's great that the Church of England continues to be propped up and that the bishops continue to get their bills paid when they're not running churches very well. Likewise, I also think that there's not the same fear of a Christian culture in parts of Europe, and there's just sort of a shrug about, yeah, Christian culture is fine. So I think that's something that to admire. So I think that we can kind of look and share the good and the bad with Christian brothers and sisters in Western Europe, in Great Britain. I think a deeply flawed reflex among some conservative evangelicals is they don't think there's conservative Christians anywhere else but America, which is not the case. Like I said, I'm an Anglican. There's 75, 80 million of us scattered around the world. And so I think that reflex to sort of think, well, the only conservative Christians are guys who must kind of look and talk like me and live in, Nashville or Grand Rapids or wherever it is. I think we need to be more international in these conversations, and I'm hoping that will be my next book project. Actually, is to do this in a 19th century context. So, Alistair, I will look forward to talking to you about that for sure. So,
Well, Bill, we'll be looking for that down the pike. Yeah. So here's an interesting question. Hasn't the state appropriated the moral and ethical authority duly belonging to the church? And would we say that that's a crowning achievement of Protestantism or a problem to be untangled?
well, I think that's a great question. My answer is a bit of a strange one because it will sound theocratic. I actually think it's a rejection of theocracy. I think that the state is supposed to have so the state is supposed to have some moral and ethical authority. Um, for example, the state should be able to judge what natural goods and natural evils. And so to the extent that it's charged with doing that, I think it's actually a good thing for the state to be able to do that. What's happened in the United States is I don't think the state is capable of doing that any longer. So I think what the church is having to do is actually these days the church is actually having to take up some of the mantle of what the state should be doing, and therein lies a lot of the confusion that that is happening amongst so-called American evangelicals. We've got a lot of two kingdoms confusion. For example, the idea that churches should have to that churches should speak about politics. Well, ideally, you really don't want the church to have to do that. But what's happened is culture and the state aren't capable of talking about the natural order in certain ways. And so I think what's happening is the church is actually having to take up the mantle of the state in ways that are unhelpful. And I think that's uh, perhaps the problem is that the church is trying to do things it's not really meant to do. And we've got a lot of two kingdoms confusion because of that. So I would actually prefer the church to not be political at all. I think the church is charged with doing spiritual things. The church is about saving souls, not saving states. And so the institution that should be charged with saving the state is the state. So I would actually like less politics in church. And my prayer is hopefully that we can have government that will do a better job of understanding its proper role in the future instead of abdicating it and sort of putting the church in a strange position to feel like it needs to take up the mantle, which it can't do very well. I'll give you one example. the church isn't capable of doing certain political things. The state is the institution that's ordained to be capable of doing those political things. And so I think in as much as the state doesn't do them, Christians sort of understandably ask, well, is the church's job to do this? And usually the answer is no, but it leaves us in a dangerous bind. It's why it's really important to have a state that is well ordered and committed to doing its what not only natural, but I would say God charged, God ordained duty.
That's great. Alistair's got another follow-up question here. How important to the history of debates about politics and religion in America are the distinctive ways that these questions have been pressed by the rise of Catholics and Baptists since the Revolution? Catholics and Baptists are now the two largest Christian groups, but were much smaller at the time of the founding.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point. Both Baptists and Catholics don't share the same sort of understanding about the relationship in the church and the state than historic Protestants do. I'll give you an example. I think that the great Protestant, one of the great Protestant commitments is keeping church and state appropriately separate. I think Luther's idea of the two kingdoms is really important. Luther doesn't want the church getting involved in politics inappropriately. I think for Catholics they have a papalist history that doesn't have the same commitments on church and state that, say, historic Protestants do, and neither do Baptists. So you have basically the two largest groups of Christians, and especially conservative Christians in the United States, who don't have the same landing place on church and state than historically Martin Luther or John Calvin or even Thomas Cranmer might have. And so I think that's an important tension point. It leads us having to sort of, again, address the question of what are two kingdoms. I'll give an example. The church, when I think of the church, does not have a right to hide its members from civil prosecution. For example, if a crime occurs in a church, the state has a right to go get that person in a church, right? There's no such thing as sanctuary in a Protestant order. The cops get to come in and get a bad guy, even if he's in a church. That a Catholic doesn't have the same commitment. There are Catholics, by the way, who are comfortable with what I just described. But to the degree that the Catholic Church in the United States has been Protestantized, I think that's why they do. Likewise, for Baptists, they don't actually admit that the state has the same sort of ontological existence as historical Protestants do. And so think of this. They almost do a sort of accidental reverse theocracy, whereby the state actually almost doesn't exist, that the church is actually the primary governor of people's hearts and minds. Now, that's not wrong. We believe that the church governs certain things, but really governs your soul. The church isn't totally responsible for moral governance, per se. The state is. I think that a lot of evangelicals would be uncomfortable with that. If I were to go into my church or a big Baptist church and say, all this stuff you guys are doing about morality, like it's really the state's job to do part of that, people would be horrified, right? It's the state's job to do certain aspects of moral governance, though. The law is a teacher, and I think that sort of gets lost in the wash. So it's a really good question. The degree to which it gets cleared up, hard to say, but it's a good question, and Alistair is good at good questions. So
he is good at good questions. Well, here's a follow-up question from Scott. Catholics and Baptists aside, where does the development of a significant holiness Pentecostal presence fit? Can't get more more American than holiness Pentecostal.
Man. Gosh, I will just say I'm too ignorant of that. I've thought a lot about that recently. Um, I worked at Regent University, and one of my favorite colleagues, Scott Pryor, will know him. A guy I really respected was Dale Coulter, who's a leading charismatic intellectual. I think the world of Dale. I think he's a great scholar, and I wish I would have spent more time talking to him. Um, my disposition is to view Pentecostals as sort of hypercharged Wesleyans, and so to view them as downstream from the Wesleyan tradition, which I think is broadly supportive of the American settlement in the early republic. What modern Pentecostals believe, I could not tell you, and I will admit to and probably unhelpful amount of ignorance on that community. I just don't know them. You won't be surprised to know that a guy with a Roman numeral in the back of his name has not spent a lot of time in Pentecostal churches, and so who was Rear Presbyterian. Um, so yeah, so I wish I had a better answer. I don't.
Well, there's your book, a couple books down the line, the Christianity and American
Yeah,
Pentecostalism.
the Azusa revival and the state or something like that.
There
So
you go. Well, we've got a fellow Anglican here with a question. As an Anglican, how does the sort of divide between church and state you're advocating jive with Article 37 that states that the magistrate has authority in all things, quote, whether they be ecclesiastical or civil?
yeah, so I don't think that there's actually a tension there. For example, I think that the two kingdoms understanding as I understand it, thinks that historically the state has the right not to determine doctrine, but the state does have a right to give the church a sort of heat check. And what I mean by that is the state can push ecclesiastical structures. Um, Anglicans understand this because the bishops are in the Lords. And so somebody can stand up and tell the bishops, I don't like you, or you're doing something wrong. Um, in the United States, that context is different, but not. I don't think there's a categorical difference there. For example, an officer of the state can can do things to churches. For example, so a church doesn't have the right to operate outside of the criminal code. For example, there's no get out of jail free card if you're a parish priest because you might commit some sort of crime. And so I don't view a huge distinction between, say, the rights of the state with regard to say what Article 37 and what the state already does. So I'll give you an example. If you go to nice little boutique towns in the United States, especially resort towns or retirement towns, there's certain sorts of building codes that are routinely passed. So a building has to look like X. A church doesn't have a right to disobey a building code because it's a church, right? So, if everything is supposed to be built with a certain type of stone in whatever little mountain resort town in Colorado, you can actually see this in Vail and Aspen. If you've ever been there, the Episcopal churches they look just like the rest of town, right? It wasn't because they just decided, oh, we'll do the same thing. There's some aspect of that, but it means that the state can tell the church to do certain things. So, for example, churches have to abide by building codes, right? You can't just say, no, we're not going to put in a bathroom because we can do that. My church we're doing a renovation right now. We have to follow certain building codes that our municipal government has passed. And so I don't think there's a tension there.
That's great. Well, maybe we'll just end with tell us why, and really this is just getting into your book itself, but there's a lot of people who I think are looking to resource Protestant, magisterial political theory, and they're going, outside the United States, outside American theologians to do it. And they're asking the question, like maybe America just kind of got it wrong from the beginning,
Yeah.
and we need to just kind of reconsider the whole American project. So kind of, what do you say to that?
I think a lot of it has to do with, I think it's new. For example, I grew up in the PCA, which was by 80s and 90s standards, a very conservative denomination. It still is a very healthy conservative denomination. I have a lot of affection. My parents are still PCA members. Most of my family is still PCA. We're good old Presbyterians. We've been Presbyterians since Constantine founded Presbyterianism, as one of my elders growing up joked. But I think that a lot of it has to do with a specific set of social and political innovations, particularly dealing with gender in the family. I think there's been a specific sort of, I'll call it radicalization. That's not the best word I want to use, because I don't think that the sort of fear that people are experiencing is necessarily evidence of unhealthy radicalization. But people are looking at what's happening today and going, oh, like, how did it get here? Well, I don't think that it got here because of 1789 or 1865 or even, pick whatever date you want. I think that what we're seeing is very specific, very particular, and we just can't actually say right now where it comes from because we don't know where it's going to go yet. I think it's just too soon to tell sort of what these specific things that are radicalizing everybody sort of have as their foundations. Because, for example, I think the world is very different now than when I was in high school. I was born in Christmas of 1983. And so I think that this is what's particularly making people say, well, did everything fail? It's an understandable question. I don't think what we're experiencing now has its roots in disestablishment. I actually don't think it has much to do with religion at all, admittedly.
Well, we are going to end with that. Dr. Smith, thank you so much again for joining us for this fellows lecture. And reminder, you can pick up Dr. Smith's book, Religion and Republic, Christian America from the Founding to the Civil War. You can find it to pre-order at the Davenant Institute website. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you.